say, video games, they aren't real art, even though you have like whole teams, hundreds of people toiling away for years on certain projects. So I'm kind of very happy that we can make those, we can kind of pioneer this project and start a broader discussion on the topic of video games. And the numbers prove us right, because during our last session we touched upon the fact that video games are the biggest entertainment market, I think even bigger than music and the film industry put together. So I'm not trying to pull this out too long, so I'm giving the word to Benjamin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for opening this. Yeah, well, so I guess we're just going to jump then right into the session. I'm also super stoked, especially for that session, because I got not just a normal history of video games prepared for you, but today we'll be talking about a history of video game, and why and not the history of video game is something I'm gonna get to in a moment. So of course, thank you all for joining in today and for all the viewers on the stream. So in order to approach this, as always, with a bit in a more structured way, since it's history and it's a sequence, we'll go through a couple of segments throughout this session, which are an introduction, so just to give you an idea of who's talking here again, and a bit about the project here at the Austrian Cultural Forum. Then we're going to talk a bit about historiography, because today is the history of video games, and we're not just going to talk about dates and old video games, but what is also the concept of history and how do we create histories. We're then going to talk about technology and industry as our parameters to understand the history of video games, and go then over a bit to the prehistory of video games. So we're going to be talking about, very briefly, about ancient board games, basically where it all started, and go straight into the actual start of the history, which starts with military calculators and universities, where the first so-called video games, not commercial yet, are developed. Furthermore, the era of the entrepreneurs and the early industry starts in the 70s. So we'll be talking about known names such as Atari, storming the video game industry and pioneering a standardized market by their emergence with Warner Communications, and go then over into the 80s, where we talk a bit about the Commodore 64, where we're going to talk about Nintendo and Sega as the companies that drive the video games industry further and rescue it, as we will see in a moment. We'll then go over to the 90s, talk a bit about why I'd like to call it the 3D revolution. It is the moment where 3D technology is advanced enough to be utilized in the video games industry. And instead of going on, we'll have a look at the emergence, the rise of the Polish video games industry as an alternative way to look of how the 90s continued in terms of video games. But before I will let you dusty on that, I am already during the first session, so I will be very brief. I'm an educator and researcher in game studies, design and development. I work at the Polish-Japanese Academy of Information Technology, where I'm heading the PGITE Game Lab, where I basically supervise and support students with their diplomas on video games, and work there as a lecturer on the topic, but also collaborate with different institutions such as the Austrian Cultural Forum. Furthermore, I work as a video game tester in localization, where I work on games that are currently in production that I'm unfortunately not able to talk about further. Furthermore, I'm an advisor and supervisor, so I supervise projects at the university by students or whoever want to do something on video games, but I also advise cultural institutions, smaller studios, museums in they come to me with their projects, and they're asking for methodologies in either implementing game design, how to approach certain projects, and I consult them then. So this is what I do. If you're interested in more, check out my research. I'm also on LinkedIn. Furthermore, our game lab is launching our first game jam in the next month. So if you're interested in that, check out mclick game jam. Just type it into Google, or we can put it into the description box. It's a game jam on climate change. All right. So why are we here today for this session on rethinking video games? So when we sit together with the Cultural Forum, we thought that we wanted to talk about video games, but more in an open, critical discussion. Basically, not just showing how amazing and super it is, but also talking about it in different angles. So we wanted to talk about also our knowledge about video games that is largely outdated today. A lot that we know about video games is from the media, especially from the late 90s and 2000s. So there's still a lot of things that we have to rework, or educators as in order to get our knowledge on games straight. It can help you to understand and enjoy video games in a new and exciting way, to see and regard video games as a cultural and also like a philosophical venture for yourself, and it may also challenge your views as a developer and designer. So today we'll start with our session on a history of video games. Further sessions will follow, but the history is today our main focus. And since we're starting from the bottom up, I'd like to give a question to the audience. I mean, I'm pretty sure that someone can answer that, because we all talk about history all the time. We use it in constant ways how we deal with history, and not all of us have a PhD in history. So I'll just give it up into the audience. What is history? What do you think history is, or what does it mean? There's no right and wrong in this, at least not here. All right, I'll take it from here. That is okay. Well, history can be many things. But in one certain aspect, it is for sure a sequence of events that is presented. And usually, when a sequence of events is presented, things are excluded. If I were to ask any of you, what did you do today? Probably not all of you would give me the whole totality of what you did, from going to the toilet, brushing your teeth, and all of that. You would choose certain events that represent the totality of you did, but surely not all the details. And with that, I'd like to present you this ancient artifact. Well, it's called the Welt-Blundell Prism, but it doesn't say what it really is. So I'll let you think a bit about it, but I'm going to reveal it straight away. So this is, in archaeology and history, considered the first historical document. It is the so-called Sumerian king list. It's the first document that documents a sequence of kings. And that has been done to allow kings to justify their rule. It is an amazing document in human history and archaeology that shows that humans were already very eager on trying to find proof for why things are today as they are based on the past. So this is a perfect example for this aspect of that history is a sequence that tries to justify the present. But in order to look at history, we cannot just pick out random events and look at things in different ways. We need to pick certain parameters in order to define our scope. So when looking at video games, we can look at many things. We can look at the sound effects and the music in video games, at the graphics. But today, we're going to look only or mainly at two things, which is the technology that drives video games and the industry that sustains it. And with technology, I mean the computational means that allow the creation of video games and playing video games. That could be from the computer and the hardware that is used to create a video game, to the controller that allows players to interact, to the monitor that is used to send visual feedback to the player. With the industry, in a fairly Marxist sense, I mean the material and immaterial forces that sustain the market and the production cycle of video games, from basic testers like I am most of the week, to people who are giving you a lecture on video games and help the industry to sustain itself, to developers, animators, to whole corporate conglomerates that are producing video games on large scales. This is the industry. But before we reach that point, there was a time where there was no industry, and there was fairly also little technology compared to what we have today. And again, I'm going to give it up to the audience for you to ask what the heck that is that I'm showing you here. That kind of looks like teeth. Any idea? It's also written there, but yes, please.
The game was the...
Yeah, well,
Like was the stones?
yeah, so it's basically a game piece, or could be seen as a game piece, but in its biology, or rather in its actual origin, those are knuckle bones from pigs. And these were used already in prehistory way earlier than this date here indicated, to forecast the future, and to gamble. Gambling existed in human civilization way earlier than games. During our last session, we talked about the difference between play and games. Play being basically the drive to release, in a way, the need to do something dynamic, and the game being a system that accommodates this particular way to play. These knucklebones were thrown around to see what happens, to either forecast the future or to gamble for your grain savings or whatever, and indicate the first use of these means. Pretty soon afterwards, humans, especially during the great period of the antiquity where humans get settled, build up civilization, people start to have enough time to develop whole systems. What we have here is basically the first form of Ludo, or in German, Mensch ärgere dich nicht, which is a racing game where your goal is to reach from the beginning of that entrance, the end of the map by using one of these stones, while the other player is doing the same, and you bounce off the other player all the time. So it's kind of like a competitive racing game. So these games were already seen. And why this is an important aspect is because it introduces game design and a system to play, which obviously becomes even also the more important for video games. This development continues with the ancestor of chess, which originally comes from India and shows a more sophisticated way and approach to game design, having a competitive play that stretches our long cultures and is also integrated in multiple societies, since we all know that these chess figures can look also very differently. So we have a solid game design, also a cultural representation. We're almost at video games, but a last thing I'd really like to show you, since we'll be talking about the industry. And there is a profound difference between Monopoly and chess and the different games that I showed you here today. The main difference is that this happens already after the emergence of capitalism. Because before not video games, but normal games were produced as a cultural activity, as a social activity, and they were not mass-produced for consumers. This happens mostly in the 19th century and in the 20th century with games such as Monopoly. And the very interesting thing is about Monopoly, not just that it is extremely and one of the most popular and most sold board games in the world, it is not just part of capitalism, but it is about capitalism, which gives you an intimate view into the nature of the games industry also nowadays. Okay, there was the prehistory of video games in very short. Very, very, very short. There is so much more to be said about it. But again, I would like to ask a question to the audience, which is one question that I carry around with me since I graduated in archaeology with a thesis on ancient board games. Namely, are video games the successors to board games? Is it like a legitimate lineage that leads from board games to video games? Can just answer yes or no. I'm not going to give me an argument. Does anyone agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, why? Gotcha.
I don't know, because there's like a thought process behind it, and you have to design the game, and you have to interact with the game, and it's basically like what does it set apart? How is it different from a modern video game?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds legitimate, and I would also say that I agree with that. But are there any voices that would say no, it's not the legitimate successor of?
I would say no.
Mm-hmm.
Because board games are more like a social thing.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the games excluded multiplayer or co-op,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, are player versus computer,
Mm-hmm.
things like that.
Okay, well, in any case, I would just point you towards the game World of Warcraft or League of Legends, where you have also social aspects. But there are aspects.
Yeah, of course.
There are aspects that point towards both ways. At the end of the day, of course, we cannot tell because this is all just theory. But one of the main differences is how video games emerged in comparison to normal board games and their purposes. At at the beginning. Another aspect is that you can play video games by yourself and you don't need another player. I think you can play alone solitaire, right? I think that is something you can play fairly alone. But generally, I would say that is a trait. And the emergence of video games is fairly interesting and not that glorious because it had mostly to do with warfare. Because video games, as we think again about technology being the computational means to create video games, are dependent on computers. And computers were mostly developed already before, but especially developed in the Second World War to calculate missile trajectories and, to help artillerymen shoot down planes. Because trying to hit an object in air while it's flying and you're trying to move your artillery gear is fairly difficult. So in order to do that properly, you need a calculation, a fairly complex calculation. So smart people at different universities started building computers, which are basically calculators. This was the basis where people already thought that, okay, you can put in calculations and then they will produce a result. But it wasn't until the development of visual output that scientists and researchers realized that they could paint things, and something that we know in game studies today, or what we call the state of the game. A game always will show you a particular state and how it looks at the moment, and that happens at the visual output. One of the first so-called video games being Noughts and Crosses by a researcher who has basically run a calculation through this big computer, not probably the same given the time period, and then that calculation would then draw an image on the monitor. Basically like you put in dates of into a coordinate system and you get some output. Then the second player would put in another calculation and then it would play something else. And this shows you that at video games, there is the development of the so-called gameplay loop. So you're a player, you create input for the system, and the system will then visualize it for you, and on basis of that, you create another input, and so on. Good games being fairly addictive in that way. A couple of years later, we have then this is usually called the so-called first video game, which is Space War, was developed at MIT by researchers who wanted to impress their investors. So at that time, computers were only at high-tech research labs or at universities, and only highly specialized personnel could work on them because a computer like that would cost, well, if you calculate the inflation in $1.5 million, so probably you don't want to have anyone playing with it. However, the researcher working on that, Steve Russell, thought it would be cool to show the investors of the lab that you could also create video games. And the investors were very happy, and they funded their next project. And the interesting thing that happens here is also that we have the development of the first controllers, more or less like the first sophisticated controllers, where two players could then play one of these rockets and shoot at each other, which is also a great example of how video games represent the epoch in they're created, because 1960s known for the space race between the Soviet Union and the US. Okay, couple of years later, 10 years, is then the period where we have the emergence of the so-called first commercial video game, which was a huge flop. And if you look closer at the game that is playing right here, I think you can guess why it was a flop. Any idea? Can you see anything? Right. Why would you create a bunch of stars and then you create, your spaceship in the same color? Well, not a good idea, but back then computers didn't have the processing power and the graphics to do both things at the same time. However, marketing was fairly on fleek, but people realized that the game wasn't that good and it was not that of a success. But Dabney and Bushnell eventually went on to create one of the most infamous companies in video game history, which is Atari. But before we're going to talk about Atari, I would like to show you an attempt to create the first home console, which was not successful, but I'd like us to look at an original commercial from that time.
all the exciting action
basically just the same game with different backgrounds. Awesome, thank you. So, the Magnavox Odyssey was created by Ralph Baer to try to bring in video games into the homes of players. Oh, I guess that's not ours. Oh, can I click on that? So, the point being that at that time, arcade games was this what video game developers saw as the big money-making machine and the future of video games, to basically lure in players into arcade halls and make them pay for it. Ralph Baer thought that eventually creating video games for the home would be more successful. It wasn't at that time because the technology wasn't good enough. The other thing, it was also wrongly marketed, as most buyers thought that they need the system, so not just the console, but the TV from the same company, which was fairly expensive at that time. But we'll look at another game that I'm pretty sure most of you will know. It's Pong. And if some of you paid close attention to the video by the Magnavox Odyssey, I think you realized that it looked fairly the same. And it was because Atari ripped it off from the Magnavox Odyssey, and they had to pay tens of millions of dollars later on, which is also the start of how lawyers made their entry into the video games industry. Pong became one of the most successful video games in history, not just because it made a ton of money for Atari, but also because of its design. Because it is a perfect example for a video game that is easy to learn, but hard to master. And it was also, you could see that Atari, or the founders of it, they learned from their earlier mistakes. So instead cluttering their screen full with stuff, they just focused on the basics. They just needed basically a representation of two players, then the score, the ball, and dividing the screen in between. That's it. And if you're going to play Atari today, I promise you it's going to be still fun. It's basically a timeless game. It was then played on these arcade machines. There's also in Warsaw pinball station where you can play a lot of these games that I'll be showing you today. Much recommended. And in that time, especially in the 70s, video games are more or less the first, or video game developers appear as the first startups, as entrepreneurs. Because most of them graduated eventually from universities where they had these big computers in the 60s and thought that they can create a business out of that, which most of them did. So in the 70s, you have this very aggressive and competitive entrepreneur market where people are looking for an investor and then trying to sell these games to arcade stations. This is a Gunfight by Midway. Does anyone know the developer Midway? Probably not. Does anyone know the game Mortal Kombat? Yeah, well, this might be known to some of you since, well, I guess these guys were always into kind of violent video games, but I promise you it's okay to play them now and then. Okay, in the mid-70s, something significant happens that is usually overlooked when you read on the histories of video games, which is namely the acquisition of Atari by Warner Communications. This is a majorly understudied field in the history of video games, and the implications of it are then more often than seen in the so-called video game crash we will have a look at in the next slides. But what happens basically is that Warner Communications, being a company that produces and markets music and film, buys the video games industry, and they think they can run it the same way as they run all of their other outlets. So what they do is they apply standardized media industry practices in producing on large scale, which is still used today. It was a bit trying to create the wonder of Henry Ford with video games, so mass producing everything. And the second step that they did is still felt today, and a lot of companies still do that. They take money away from development and they put it all into marketing. Because big CEOs often think that if they make people believe that the game is good, when they will play it, they will actually think that it is. But reviews often show the difference. So this was a second major step that will dominate the history of video games until today. What then, however, Warner also does, it achieves almost a full monopoly on the American video games market and in Europe, owning 3/4 of the market on home consoles, not arcades. What they then do is they take basically again the idea of the Magnavox Odyssey and try to bring video games home with the Atari 2600. With, how is it known also, like with other developers, it's called the Trojan horse strategy. People buy a console, that's the Trojan horse, it arrives home, and then, well, the Greeks come out of it and attack you, but what actually happens is that you will have to constantly buy new games for your console. You're not going to an arcade station where you have all the games, you're bringing in a platform that requires more games. Also a model that is still consistent until today. What it also does, it revolutionizes game design because in arcades, in arcade halls, players would play for coins. So they would insert a coin and the game designer would try to make the game as difficult as possible to make the player pay more, right, in order to generate a revenue. What this step does is that now you have a player at home who does not have to pay pennies to continue to play, which means that a game session needs to be designed in a way that it's more longer, it needs to refer to different, it needs to draw onto different aspects and aesthetics that players expect when they're sitting in the comfort of their home and playing video games. In that case, games became more accessible, less difficult, and also had longer play times, incorporating later on stories, narratives, and other elements. But as we will see, the same step from revolutioning game design will also destroy the industry within years. Because what happens next is that, and I would like to play that next clip, which is a game by Atari, which is labeled the worst video game in history, from 1982.
Only from Atari, made especially for systems from Atari. The video game that lets you help E.T. get home. Just in time for Christmas. Happy holidays from Atari.
Well, and this game was so good that it tanked the whole industry. Can you believe it? From a market volume of $3 billion, it turns everything into ashes. Well, okay, to stay fair, it wasn't just that game, it was the whole practice that Atari was pursuing at that time by trying to produce games as cheaply as possible and trying to ask for as high prices as possible from their players. It further on had no quality standards for other developers developing video games for their console, and that eventually led to not just investors losing the trust in the video games industry as a legitimate business, but also players losing the trust in video games as a legitimate practice. Well, arcade games remained kind of like profitable for a time, but this had to be definitely reworked, and it took its time. However, meanwhile in Japan, developers were not that greedy and developed quite good games. I'll be very brief on that just to make you also understand that this was the American market and the Western market, besides Japan, where this was happening, with great games such as Space Invaders. You can also play that at the pinball station in Warsaw on an original machine. Pac-Man, great example for using proper space and the first proper use of intelligent AI in video games, and Zaxxon introducing 3D through an isometrics view in video games. Great times to be in Japan, maybe not in the US if you're a games enthusiast. Obviously, these games were also played in the arcades in the US, The problem with these games were that they used so much processing power that they couldn't be ported for the Atari home console, which made the console at its time again reaching the limits of its technologies. Then we reach the 80s, and the 80s are kind of this recovery period. The mid-80s are a recovery period for the games industry also in the US and Europe, which is driven by two developments. One development being the hacker culture that surrounds the C64, was the introduction of a computer that could be used to play video games and develop them at a fairly cheap price, just $1,500 for only that keyboard that is also a computer. But back then, that allowed the middle class to engage into hobby coding, and it made games more accessible for hobbyists to create video games, put them onto a floppy disk, and then circulate them. This also led to another problem that the industry would face soon, namely pirating. That would happen a lot. Moon Patrol is a very cool game representative of the time of the Commodore 64. It is also famous for introducing the parallax effect, something that if you're into Albert Einstein with that example of time is relative, and well, basically the impression of time and space you see here emerges out of having different backgrounds moving at the same time. That's been a technological trick that's been then used later on in 2D games. So you have the C64 introducing this grassroots movement of developers learning coding for themselves and entering the industry on their own ways. But also what you have is Japanese developers saving the trust in video games by producing games that remain iconic and examples of timeless game design, such as Super Mario or The Legend of Zelda. Super Mario being an example for the first proper platformer, which remains a genre that is still being produced and enjoyed by many people today. The Legend of Zelda introducing a more visualized journey with depth and narrative on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-80s. What you have then is that should have been a 16, sorry for that, is the 16-bit era, also dominated again by Sega and Nintendo, two Japanese companies. And the difference that you can see between these games, which are on 8-bit, and these on 16-bit, is that there is more detail. So it allowed developers, it allowed developers to include more artists into their production cycles, designers and artists to create all of these landscapes. And since these games were played at home, people wanted to also play for a long time. So there was really a lot of detail to it that had to be produced. Also on the Super Nintendo, one of the first examples of proper 3D using polygons in games. Looks very dodgy from today's standards, but back then this was fairly good, especially since such a system would run a cartridge with a storage of about 3 megabytes. What we then have is slowly the emergence of 3D because of two consoles, the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. The PlayStation emerged earlier, but I first want to talk about the Nintendo 64. Again, from Nintendo, developed Super Mario, now in 3D, allowing now players to play with new perspectives, new angles, allowing developers to allow players to explore the space, because it's fairly difficult to explore space in 2D. So in 3D, it has been like a revolution. The other thing is that technology is just ripe at that time to sustain 3D. Because at that time, you could play 3D games on arcade systems, but these were big computers that had enough processing power to render these graphics. Now you would have the capabilities to render in real time in the 1990s. PlayStation emerged earlier, had to catch up in terms of graphics pretty soon, is however known for a plethora of games such as Tomb Raider or Resident Evil, using new ways of including cinematography and camera angles in cutscenes, but also increasing video games to the aspect of narrative. So now video games would not just be games that are played for their gameplay's sake, but also as stories that can. Tomb Raider being obviously an adaptation of Indiana Jones. The original Tomb Raider blueprint was also an Indiana Jones ripoff, but they were about to get sued, so they made her a woman, which turned out to be then one of the most iconic figures in video game history. The PlayStation 1 also would then change their controller to include a DualShock analog stick. Okay, oh, I didn't want to spoiler that, but what makes the PS1 also fairly different and more important for its era, able to render all of this data, is the introduction of the CD. Well, today it seems fairly obsolete, but back then it was quite impressive how much storage a CD would have. The difference between what a cartridge like this could store, like Super Mario, and a PlayStation with Tomb Raider would be, well, I'm not good at math, so I'm just going to give you the raw numbers. So a Nintendo cartridge could sustain 50 megabytes, while a CD could store up to 600 megabytes at that time, or 1 gigabyte. So if you're good at maths, you probably did the calculation and are fairly impressed by now, but I'm not going to give you like a football stadium comparison. So the CD becomes also a smart choice for a manufacturer such as the PlayStation to bet on, and this is why in the 90s they also outrun the Nintendo 64, being one of the best-selling consoles, selling over 110 million consoles in the 90s, which is fairly impressive. And well, every PlayStation is still around, still producing, and remains and one of the biggest players on the market. Okay, our journey of the history of video games in the 90s is about to end before we then proceed into what I call the rise of the Polish games industry. But before we do that, I'd just like to give up a question back to the audience, similar question like if board games are the successors, are the predecessors of video games, do you think that, the development of video games shows clearly an inclination towards 3D from the beginning until today? Do you think that 3D is the end of the line, the end of technological progress in video games? Yes, please.
I guess it's not a line, really. I wouldn't call it a line because it's just one of the branches. And VR technology is pretty promising, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's there, but probably not also the end of the line. Like there might be, as you said, with VR, new perspectives on games. Are 2D games still around today? Yeah, probably. There has been like a major revival of two-dimensional video games. But however, the industry will always make you believe as better graphics equal a better game. And sometimes they may help to a better game, but nowadays you can also still find games in 2D. So at the end of the question it's a fairly Hegelian question about about progress and where history leads, and whether 3D is better than 2D, or if there is always like a progression that makes things better than the other. In that case, I think people who deal with video games can fairly say, nah, there are as many good video games in 2D as in 3D, and 3D and 2D is more of a choice in order to create and sustain a certain form of aesthetic experience for the player. Okay, but instead of going now on with the usual history of video game, as it's in most of the books you can find nowadays, which are going to talk and tell you about the emergence of casual games and mobile games such as Candy Crush, which is a highly addictive game and I've played too many hours on it. The emergence of Unity, democratizing game development for students, for everyone to create video games. The emergence of esports being now also included into the Olympic Games as a legitimate sport. The battle between the 2D and 3D, or one of my favorite topics, the emergence, or rather how gambling is reclaiming video games. This was also why I showed you how video games, or how the history of games actually starts with gambling, and now we are already back at it with loot boxes. But this is not the history I'm gonna end on today. Instead, I prepared for you a fairly different history, which is the history of the rise of the Polish video games industry, which remains today one of the most known and respected players among fairly other, way bigger countries. We'll go again a bit back in time, because in order to understand what happens after the 90s, we'll have to talk briefly about video games under communism, very briefly. Video games appear in Poland under the rule of communism, but mostly, not exclusively, but mostly in two ways. Either hobbyist adaptations. So in the 80s, there were already, of course, computers in Poland. There were even Ataris legally in Poland, and there were developers working on it. But there was no market. There was no way to sell these products, and there was also fairly little intellectual property protection for developers. That led mostly hobbyists, developers, and geeks, if you want to use that word, to create games such as Webmaster. It's a game from two or three guys from Wrocław. Not that much known to the game, but it seems to have been a game where you play as a spider and you need to kind of like eat smaller insects and be aware of other bigger spiders, which reminds me fairly of Pac-Man, why I call it a pretty cool adaptation of that. The other kind of games that appear in Poland in the 80s are localizations, which are games produced by Western producers, developers, and are then localized in Polish, mostly the manuals or the posters for it, and the in-game text. And one of the games, which seems, according to the internet, to have been the first legally localized game and then also sold game in Poland, The Trapdoor, which is based on a comic series from the UK. So you have these hobbyist adaptations and localizations. So you have video games and you have video game enthusiasts, but you have no market. And this changes after the fall of the Soviet Union and also after the revolution of 1989, where Poland gains its own independence from the communist rule. And what we then have is the introduction of the liberal market in Poland. My father is from Silesia, and he always tells me the 90s were fairly wild times. And one element of that wild times is this. Does anyone know what this is? Excuse me? No, but what is this? Yeah, it's an electro bazaar, which is fairly common and popular in Poland, and a way how to get your video games from abroad. Because you would find a lot of hackers and developers either importing games, copying them, pirating them, and you could then buy them on these markets. And you would find these two companies already selling games on these markets in the mid-90s. CD Projekt, not Red yet, and Techland. I don't know, my research thinks that it's Bazar Sadyba in Warsaw, and apparently to a blog post it is, but I cannot say for certain because it wasn't printed in a book. All right, so you have CD Projekt and Techland going to these markets and trying to find a business model to run video games and bring them to game enthusiasts and players. CD Projekt obviously being then the company that is known to then arise out of that. Techland, a really important and overlooked company from a foreign perspective at some times. But CD Projekt kind of like continues to sell in the 80s. And what you have then is that CD Projekt scores their first gig with Baldur's Gate by BioWare, I think. And it's a huge success in Poland, and also shows Europe and the US that Poland is a market worth investing, which leads CD Projekt to then localize and publish titles in cooperation with Atari, which is at that time a publisher, such as Diablo or further Baldur's Gate titles. And yeah, here you can see the founders of CD Projekt, I think even one of them being Marcin Irwinski, packing in localized versions of Baldur's Gate to then go and sell them. Fairly cool. That I don't know at which electronics fairs that takes place. But before an actual industry can emerge in Poland. So you have these localizations, you have these different companies. Techland already in the early 2000s producing a video game, a shooter video game. But before this becomes an actual market, what needs to happen is that Poland joins the EU. Does anyone have an idea why that might have helped Poland to develop a sustainable video games industry? Which benefits arose about joining the EU in 2004?
Open marketplace.
Yes, open marketplace.
Investments from EU.
Investments, money, obviously. Yeah. So definitely an open marketplace, but also an open Europe to travel, for the developers to go to different fairs, to different conventions. It's a Schengen zone. You can go wherever you want. It becomes easier to meet people. It becomes easier to sell people your product, and it becomes easier also to find investors for Polish developers. And of course, the massive infrastructure grants that are then reinvested into Poland are also funneled since 2004, and definitely since 2006, but I think also since 2004, into the games industry, which was a very smart move by the Polish government back then to already realize video games as an phenomenon, as an opportunity to invest in, which they are still doing today. Does anyone know The Witcher? It's been also funded by the government. This is why also The Witcher 3 was given to Barack Obama by Tusk, by his arrival here, as an example of a gift from Poland. However, there's another fairly interesting thing that happens, and if you remember, I said that there was no intellectual property protection. Now, in the 90s, technically, there is one, but it is not legally enforced. Not until Poland joins the EU, where then Poland has to enforce these intellectual property rights as part of to be a legitimate EU member state. So suddenly developers cannot just develop video games, but they're also protected. So their software cannot be stolen without any legal repercussions, which not just allows developers to develop their games and focus on them, but also gives investors with foreign capital more security to invest again into Poland. It was very important for the development of the Polish games industry. And all of these then amount to one of a historical release for the Polish video games industry, which is The Witcher, which was based on a famous fictional book, The Witcher, also by a Polish author, bringing more or less the take on video games by Poland to the world. And I would like to see that trailer. I think we all would like to see that cinematic trailer, which is not a gameplay trailer. Obviously, this is not how the game really looks like, since it's a cinematic trailer. And the interesting thing about The Witcher, and this is probably a story that you will not find on the company's website, however, it's super interesting, this is why I'll be sharing it, is that if you remember, CD Projekt was doing localizations for Western developers. And apparently there was a game from the Baldur's Gate series, which was a role-play game. It was the second or the third part that was cancelled. However, CD Projekt had the rights on the code of the game. So when the game was cancelled, the developers said, do whatever you want with that code. We don't need it. We don't have any money to finish it. And that game then became CD Projekt. Not CD Projekt, became The Witcher. So The Witcher is originally based on the core code of a different game. They had the rights on it, so it's all legal, but just funny trivia about it. And this game had such an impact on the international scene. It was praised by different studios, by different countries, was a top seller. And it also popularized the book series internationally, receiving several translations afterwards. Today, even receiving the Netflix series based on the game. So big hype on a very good game. But it also presents two cores that we will in a moment see can be identified at what a Polish video game looks like, which is fairly dark aesthetics, but also an honest narrative and fairly a lot of narrative within it. And after the release, which was very popular, a lot of these companies existing already before the release, but it shows that the Polish market is a market not just worth investing in, but also capable of competing with big players on the market from France, Canada, the US, Japan, and ensures a lot of studios to stay also in Poland and remain also their own capital. Because at that time it was also a movement that we see, for example, in Germany or in Austria, where studios are usually instantly bought up by foreign companies, either from China or from UK or from France or the US. And Poland being fairly proud of their games and keeping them to themselves, accepting investment but trying to keep ownership over the game. I think it's not a coincidence why you see most of the logos also in the colors of the Polish flag, also an identifier for Polish games, and a lot of big companies producing games. 98% of all games produced in Poland are exported and appreciated in the rest of the world. For three ingredients that I think apply to many successful Polish video games, but are not necessarily exclusive. So there are obviously also other Polish video game companies that produce other games, but what I would say is the ingredients for success in the Polish games industry to compete with such big players is that they are focusing on gameplay. They're focusing on the experience of the video game itself, how the game plays, investing fairly not that much into marketing. That changes now a bit, as we will see in a moment, and a gravitation towards tradition, which means that Polish developers are excited about games from the past and games that also are timeless and that are still played and are heavily inspired by game concepts that are proved and tested and enjoyable. The other thing is that what I would like to call honest narratives. So there is a certain taste in these games that is somewhere in between, well, thrilling and dramatic and serious, but also a bit like a Tarantino movie with a lot of sarcasm, which is also very popular, especially as they are merged with these dark aesthetics. Especially these companies produce almost exclusively games that have these rather dark aesthetics and these honest or brutal narratives, which are very popular as they offer also a stark counter model to the Western market that is striving for more accessibility, more colorful games. So in a sense, they which makes them clearly stand out on the market. And the other thing, as you can again see with the logos, there is a sense of responsibility to represent Poland. And this comes not just from the games themselves and the heritage that flows into the games, but also from the developers themselves, which many of them I have talked to, where you always feel that they're to show the world that Poland can produce top-notch video games. This is something that is not necessarily of a studio. A studio is a corporate enterprise that is there to make money and will make decisions to generate more capital. So feeling a sense of responsibility can sometimes, well, be difficult if you have a strict business model, but this is something that has been also present in the Polish games industry, but is also being currently challenged, as we will see in a moment. One game fairly representative of another huge step in the Polish games industry, and the representation has been the game This War of Mine, which is an adaptation of the siege on Sarajevo in the 90s, and where players take the roles of refugees or victims of war that need to survive in a war zone. Has been much praised all around the world for its gameplay, for its narrative, and has been even last year announced to be included into the high school curriculum of Polish students in order to learn about, not just incorporate video games into the curriculum, but also learn about these kind of peculiar situations, which, if you reflect on the current political situation, makes sense to confront students with. So could we play that video? It's a gameplay trailer containing footage of the actual game.
For soldiers, war is about victory. For us, it was about getting food. I lived through hell with these people. We were a group. We would do anything to stay alive. I will never forget those days. Things you see in war stay with you forever.
Okay, another really great example to again see, it's an absolute different game than The Witcher, but it does have a very similar aesthetics, since also 11-bit studios emerged out of a group of developers that worked at CD Projekt. But the game is very representative of this overall Polish style of these harsh aesthetics, gameplay focused, and having honest narratives, as I like to call it. So there is nothing, no attempt to make it seem, to sugarcoat it. Yeah, I think that would be the right term. And this is something that has been much appreciated all over the world by players and much praised. I think there was The Guardian that wrote, gruesome but beautiful, and I think that kind of really is a good description for the overall Polish style of video games. However, there are, of course, games and developers in Poland that do different games and in different ways. Today, the Polish industry is at a crossroads. It has grown significantly. It has received a lot of praise from outside, a lot of foreign capital invested, a lot of studios have opened up, a lot of games being produced every year, and many people talking about the Polish games industry, a lot of people resettling to come to Poland to work for companies. But the industry today is at a crossroads, simply because of that responsibility to sustain and maintain this big market. And as we have seen with Atari in the late 70s, money can make you kind of greedy. And Cyberpunk 2077 from CD Projekt is a good example for a really great game. Everyone who has played it after several patches knows that this is a very, at least decent video game that will stand the test of time. However, what I'll be telling next, I will say after the trailer. So could we play that, please?
In 2077, they voted my city the worst place to live in America. Main issues, sky-high rate of violence, and more people living below the poverty line than anywhere else. Can't deny it, it's all true. But everybody still wants to live here. This city's always got a promise for you. Might be a lie, an illusion. But it's there, just around the corner. And it keeps you going. It's a city of dreams, and I'm a big dreamer.
All right. So what you just saw was an announcement trailer. I think I think it was 2019 or 2017. So before release, what you saw again was similar as to The Witcher, a cinematic trailer. This is not actual footage from the video game. This game was announced, I think by now it's almost 10 years ago, and it had to be probably for a long time in production or in pre-production. But eventually, when the day came to release that game, shortly before the Christmas market in 2020, that game was released in an unbearable state to the market. It was completely broken. It was the first time in the history that the PlayStation Store removed a game from its market because of the amount of complaints that it received. Investors from the US filed class action lawsuits against the company for being frauded into investing into a game that wasn't ready. A lot to take. And that happened because of the size and the growth of the Polish games industry in so short time. A lot of people wanted to get their piece of the cake, so to speak. At the end, the game has been fixed afterwards and receives now again positive reviews. But this event of this game receiving a budget for marketing again that is way higher than what was spent for development shows that the Polish games industry reached a point where it is at a crossroads, similar as the American industry back then, and is still at a crossroads, not ready to leave either way, but is at a point where it needs to decide what weighs more: the satisfaction of their customers, of their players, of their consumers, however you want to call them, or immense return on investment. Because believe it or not, the game was able to break even within the first week. So the game itself costed in budget at least 200 million euros and was able to get that all back within the first week, even though the game was almost unplayable. This is obviously was a huge cut into the trust of the player base and was very difficult to regain by now. The company is doing now way better and has promised to learn from its mistake. But it has also shown that how a rising star can always fall and be corrupted, more or less. So in that regards, everyone remains very curious. However, I don't want to say that CD Projekt remains the only company, if you're interested in the video games industry, to look at, since there are many new studios starting up, established studios like Techland or 11-bit studios still producing very good games. And yeah, basically an exciting time to look at, but also a challenging time in terms of mass production and the aspects of capitalism embedded in the industry. So this brings us to our conclusion for today, and then we'll have a QA session if needed, if you have any questions. So, and from this session, I'd like you to take home, or whatever you learned today, that there is a multitude of histories. And it really depends on how you choose your parameters. In which way do you look at history? What argument are you trying to make out of history? And that will create a, but not the, history of something. Today, we had a general view on the video games industry and technology and the rise of the Polish video games industry, so heavily industry focused. There were many other examples that could have been said, but we just have limited time. We all have limited aspects of concentration. However, there remains more to be explored. But what we might have seen today is that video games remain fundamentally dependent on technology and shaped by the industry. What that means is that while going through history, we have seen that video games didn't start up as 3D rendered games, but were always blessed and cursed by the state of technology of their time. They couldn't do anything. However, sometimes the limitations made developers very, very creative. But regardless of the technology, video games are shaped by the industry. This means from economical aspects, some games are just cancelled because they don't bring any monies. People are fired because these projects are not sustainable in a monetary sense. But also the industry is today shaped by politics. Accessibility, inclusion of overlooked ethnicities, minorities in video games is a discussion that shapes the industry today and shapes video games. So the video games at the end, how they look and how they play, doesn't just depend on the technology, but also about the material and immaterial forces that dominate the market and the production of video games. And at last, I was really happy to show you an alternative outcome out of this history. Instead of going one of the usual tracks, I showed you that the Polish video games industry reached a state where it itself is a sustainable, growing market in which you can find great games, but also a whole profession. But also, it has a history that remains understudied. So in that regard, I hope I could unravel some aspects of a history that remains out there, but still remains to be told. And I'd like to sensitize you towards other histories and alternative histories in regards to video games that you probably not are aware of, such as our local history here of the Polish games industry. And with that, those are the sources that I used here for today. You can find me either on LinkedIn, you can find my research on my research page. And with that, thank you very much for listening and your attention. That we cut out, yeah? All right, okay, if there are not more any questions, then you can also approach me after this event. So I think we're gonna close it then here. Thank you everyone very much for chiming in, whoever is there. We'll have another session in 1 month on whether video games are art. So feel free to join again. And again, thank you very much for joining. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.